Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita, Kansas government and public affairs. We're broadcast on KGPT Channel 26.1, also its companion website, kgpt26.com. Some of you may know me from my blog. It's the Voice for Liberty on the internet at wichitaliberty.org. The motto there is individual liberty, limited government, and free markets in Wichita and Kansas. If you'd like to learn more about the issues covered today or to contact me, please visit wichitaliberty.org, subscribe to the email newsletter, like the Voice for Liberty on Facebook, follow me, Bob Weeks, on Twitter. Well, this week, the Kansas Legislature is back in session after a break. And the biggest challenge our state's lawmakers face is balancing the budget for next year. Current projections of revenue and spending show that there is not enough revenue to support the level of spending that the legislature has decided on in its budget. Now, depending on how you look at things, the state has either a revenue problem or a spending problem. Liberals and progressives uniformly say we have a revenue problem. They cite the income tax cuts of a few years ago, and their solution is to restore the old higher tax rates and therefore bring more money to the state. Conservatives have generally said the state has a spending problem, and the way to balance the budget is to cut spending. But this is changing now. Many conservatives are embracing more revenue, that is, higher taxes. Here's an example from Wichita Eagle reporting. The newspaper said, Representative Steve Brunk, a Wichita Republican, has been a staunch opponent of tax increases. Last year, he told Americans for Prosperity in a candidate survey that he would not raise taxes, and he also has signed the Norquist Pledge. It's a different world today, Brunk said of the survey he filled out before the state's revenue problems set in. Brunk said he's still wrestling with the idea of raising taxes given the massive budget hole the state faces. He still wants to see more budget cuts, but he's not sure whether that's enough to fill the deficit. There's my personal ideology on this issue, Brunk said. Then there's the uncomfortable reality of where we are. And end quote from the Wichita Eagle. Now, many other conservatives in Kansas are sending the same messages as Representative Brunk, who represents a section of northeast Wichita, including my home. This is distressing to hear lawmakers toss aside ideology, because an ideology is something that you really believe in. The dictionary says that an ideology is a set of doctrines or beliefs that are shared by the members of a social group or that form the basis of a political, economic, or other system. It's not something you toss aside when the going gets tough, when circumstances change. It's something that you really believe, a foundational belief. Now, liberals are not discarding their ideological belief that there should be more taxation and spending, so why are conservatives abandoning their beliefs? I understand that it is difficult for politicians to cut spending. Cutting taxes is easy by comparison. But the Kansas Legislature has had time to prepare for this day, and despite being in the hands of conservative leadership, the legislature did not take the steps to reform state spending to match the tax cuts that were passed. The legislature, quite simply, finds itself in a difficult situation of its own making. The budget bill under consideration in the Kansas Legislature this year calls for spending $3 million for the production of an efficiency analysis review. This is a good idea, but it is too late to help the legislature balance the budget this year and next. Trimming Kansas government spending is a long-term project. A few years ago, the legislature looked at several bills that would help control spending, but the bills failed to become law. Had they been passed when introduced, the state would be in a much better position to make the needed reforms. But a look at the history of these bills leads us to wonder if the leaders of our state government, both in the executive and legislative branches, are really serious about controlling spending. The three bills concerned creating a streamlining commission, a privatization initiative, and creating performance measures. They were in play during the 2011 and 2012 legislative sessions. They all passed the House of Representatives in 2011, but given that the Senate was in the hands of moderate Republicans, there was little chance that the bills would also pass the Senate. And that's what happened. Each bill died in the Senate. Moderate Republicans and their Democratic allies were not in favor of reforming Kansas state government spending. But starting with the 2013 session, the Senate has been in conservative hands. So, have these bills been reintroduced? Well, with the exception of the efficiency analysis review I mentioned and a look at K-12 education, I don't believe these bills or anything else like them have been introduced or considered. Both chambers of the Kansas Legislature and the governor's mansion have been under the control of conservatives for 3 years, but no serious initiative to control spending has emerged, with the exception of the Efficiency Task Force on K-12 education. This ought to cause voters to ask if the desire and will to cut spending truly exists. And I find it curious that liberals and progressives in Kansas are opposed to efforts to increase government efficiency. They all blasted the school task force. If the government services that liberals support are truly vital, well, they ought to insist that they are delivered as efficiently as possible so that the greatest number may benefit to the greatest extent. But that doesn't happen. But there is a path forward. Recently, I attended a meeting where a speaker reported his observations of state workers wasting time while at work. They were playing computer games. He contrasted that to the private sector, where he said this waste is less likely to happen. He asked, shouldn't we investigate state agencies looking for instances of waste and when found, eliminate the waste? Well, that's a good idea, but it's something that I think would be difficult to accomplish. There is an easier way to root out inefficiencies in the operations of state government and local and federal government too, for that matter. And that is to use the benefits for the private sector that the speaker praised. We can do this by outsourcing government functions to the private sector. Then the work is done under the motivations that exist in the private sector. Kansas Policy Institute produced a report in 2013 that shows how Kansas can save money using the principles of privatization and outsourcing. The report is titled Better Service, Better Price: How Privatization Can Streamline Government, Improve Services, and Reduce Costs for Kansas Taxpayers. You can read it at kansaspolicy.org or wichitaliberty.org. Reforms of this nature take some time to implement. Several years ago, Kansas governmental leaders had time to start the state on a path to reform, but they did not do that. Now these same leaders are considering raising taxes to balance the Kansas budget. This did not have to happen. There's a lot of blame to spread around, which probably means that no one will be held accountable. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. What recourse do citizens have when elected officials are not responsive? Initiative and referendum are two possibilities, and citizens in Wichita have exercised these rights to make changes at the municipal level, but Kansans are not able to do this at the state level. Initiative is when citizens propose a new law and then gather signatures on petitions. If a successful petition is filed, the matter is usually placed on a ballot for the people to vote whether the proposed law will become actual law. Examples of initiative in Wichita are the proposal to add fluoride to Wichita water, which voters rejected, and this year there was the proposal to reduce the penalties for possession of small amounts of marijuana. That passed, but has not taken effect pending legal action in the Kansas Supreme Court. Referendum is sort of the opposite of initiative. Referendum is when citizens petition to overturn an act passed by a governing body. An example is the 2012 repeal of a charter ordinance passed by the Wichita City Council. So at the municipal level in Kansas, citizens have the right of initiative, although in practice the right is limited, and the right of referendum is more narrowly limited than even that. But at the state level, there is simply no possibility for citizens to exercise initiative or referendum. Kansas law does not allow for this. Initiative and referendum allow citizens to vote on specific laws or policies. This is contrasted with elections for office, where voters must choose candidate A or candidate B. And voters have to take the entire package of positions associated with a candidate. It is not possible to select some positions from candidate A and others from candidate B. So, when a candidate wins an election, can we really say why? Which of the candidates' positions did voters like, and which did voters not like? Results of regular elections rarely provide a clear answer. Initiative and referendum, however, let citizens vote on a specific law or proposal. There is little doubt as to the will of the voters. Yes, there is a difference between voting for politicians and voting for policies and laws. When given a chance, Wichitans have often voted differently from what the Wichita City Council wanted. An example is the 2012 overturn of a charter ordinance the council passed. Another is the failure of the sales tax in November 2014. Now, that matter was on the ballot not because of citizen initiative, but it is an example of voting directly for an issue rather than a candidate. And you remember that citizens rejected the sales tax by a wide margin, contrary to the clear wishes of the city council, city bureaucrats, and the rest of Wichita's political class. It's different voting for policies than politicians. For one thing, the laws passed by initiative don't change, at least for some period of time. But politicians and their campaign promises have a short shelf life and are easily discarded or modified to fit the current situation. We saw that in today's first segment, where conservatives in the Kansas Legislature are tossing aside their core beliefs and the pledges they signed. If you're not convinced that initiative and referendum is a good idea, consider this. Politicians do not want it. That may be its best argument. Generally, politicians and bureaucrats don't want citizens to be empowered with initiative and referendum. When the Wichita City Council was forced to set an election due to the successful petition regarding the Ambassador Hotel issue, reactions by council members show just how much politicians hate initiative and referendum. Council member Pete Meitzner, who represents East Wichita, he wanted to move the election to an earlier date so as to avoid community discourse and debate. Councilmember Janet Miller, she represents North Central Wichita, she expressed concern over dragging this out, and she said she wants to get it over with as soon as we can so that we can move on. And in his remarks, former Mayor Carl Brewer advocated having the election as soon as possible. He told the city, by doing that, it eliminates a lot of turmoil inside the community, unrest. Well, as you can see by these remarks, politicians don't like citizens second-guessing their actions. They don't like discourse and debate in the community. When citizens challenge the city council, our former mayor said it causes turmoil and unrest. Initiative and referendum give citizens the power to force office holders to shut up and listen. John Funn said it best. He wrote, "Without initiatives and referendum, Elites would barely bother at all to take note of public opinion on issues they disdained. From supermajority requirements to raise taxes to term limits, they serve as a reminder that the experts sometimes have to pay attention to good old common sense. A criticism often leveled against initiative and referendum is that the ballots will be crowded with questions submitted by citizens. But as anyone who has been involved in a petitioning effort can tell you, filing a successful petition is not a simple or easy matter. The first petition effort to relax Wichita marijuana laws failed, with the election commissioner ruling that an insufficient number of valid signatures were submitted. Generally, petition signers must meet certain requirements such as being a registered voter and living within a certain jurisdiction. Now, the Kansas Attorney General contends that the second petition by the same group is defective because it lacks the proper legal language. It's common for the validity of petitions to be contested, either by government itself or by special interest groups that believe they will be adversely affected. Often these challenges are made on technical grounds, such as language that does not conform to some rule. And also, ballot initiatives are not guaranteed to pass. The Wichita fluoride initiative did not pass, for example. So, how can we get initiative and referendum at the state level in Kansas? Well, it will take an amendment to the Constitution for the people of Kansas to have initiative and referendum rights at the state level. That requires passage of a measure in both chambers of the legislature by a 2/3 margin, and then passage by a majority of voters. Although the governor does not play a direct role in constitutional amendments in Kansas, as they do not require the governor's signature, a governor can still have a role. In 1991, Governor Joan Finney supported initiative and referendum. An amendment passed the Kansas Senate, but did not advance through the House of Representatives. Today, it seems quite unlikely that the present Kansas legislature would support an amendment implementing initiative and referendum. Politicians just don't want to give up the power. We should note that the laws giving some initiative and referendum rights at the municipal level is a state law. By passing that law, state legislators were imposing a hardship on other elected officials, not themselves. But initiative and referendum are popular with voters. In 2013, Gallup polled voters regarding petitioning at the national level. 68% favored this, while only 23% opposed. One of the few issues that poll higher than this is term limits for office holders. By the way, do you know what citizens and states often do after gaining the right of initiative? Yes, they impose term limits on their legislatures, and they may also pass laws limiting the ability to increase taxes and spending. Lawmakers don't want you to do that. That power, they say, should be reserved for them and for them alone. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. In this last segment, I'm going to ask you to do something unusual, which is to listen to an audio recording on television. But I found its subject so compelling that I wanted to share it with you. It's from the Cato Institute. The speaker is Charles Murray, talking about his forthcoming book titled By the People, Rebuilding Liberty Without Permission. It holds an intriguing idea as to how Americans can reassert liberty. Civil disobedience. Make the federal government an insurable hazard. In this short recording, Murray diagnoses the problem and presents a way to solve it. I hope that you will take a moment to listen.
Many laws are begging for a bit of civil disobedience at the hands of those who aren't hurting anyone through their technically illegal activities. Charles Murray has an idea about how to reduce the costs of that disobedience and maybe reward it a bit. He discussed his idea at the Cato Institute's Benefactors Summit in February.
The rule of law is the foundation of civilization and is especially essential to a free society. So the decision to engage in civil disobedience is not to be taken lightly. The first chapters of the book lay out the case that we have reached the point at which in our history civil disobedience is justified. Summarizing very quickly, in my view, America's system has been transmuted into something bearing only a structural resemblance to what the founders had in mind. The substance of what they created is nearly gone. I have found myself convinced of these truths. Some of this convincing has happened fairly recently. First, the founders' Constitution has been discarded and distorted in ways that cannot be fixed for reasons that are inextricably embedded in constitutional jurisprudence. Aspects of America's legal system are lawless for reasons that are inextricably embedded in the use of law for social agendas. Congress and the regulatory state have become systemically corrupt for reasons that are inextricably embedded in the market for government favors. The federal government is in a state of advanced sclerosis for reasons that are inextricably embedded in the nature of advanced democracies. Inextricably embedded means that solutions are beyond the reach of the electoral process and legislative process. The citizenry is impelled to create new counterweights. I take about 100-some pages of fairly dense text to make those cases. I now turn to the question of how we are going to go about rolling back the regulatory state. And I'll illustrate it with a true story. It's the reason the book got written. My wife knows a guy in a town near us that I will call Bob. I can't identify him because it's too dangerous. Bob operates one of the many kinds of businesses that use Latino workers. What makes Bob different is that all of his Latino workers are documented. He spends 20 to 30 grand per year getting visas for his workers. He pays good wages, pays for their airfares. He's a model citizen of his community, a model employer. And guess what? He has been relentlessly harassed by the federal government. And my wife would come home and tell me the latest stories he had relayed to her about what they've been doing to him. And there were lots of them. And the first reaction was, why pick on him? He's done the right thing. He's documented his workers. Why don't they go after all the people who have 100% undocumented immigrants? He opened himself up by documenting his workers to easy enforcement by the regulators. He made himself a soft target. The story that tipped me over the edge involved a stupid regulation that Bob could not comply with. He didn't have enough American-born workers. He couldn't comply with it. He puts ads in the papers. The unemployment office sends him people who come into his office and say, I'm coming out here because I need to have interviews in order to maintain my unemployment benefits, but I don't want a job here. There's no way he could get Americans to work for him, and he was being forced to pay large fines because he didn't have enough. He became so frustrated that at one point he said to the bureaucrat who was harassing him, I'm going to fight this in court. To which the bureaucrat said, you fight this and we will put you out of business. And he knew that was true. At this point, I was getting so mad. Again, I'm not making any of this up. This is the reason the book got written. That I said to my wife, I don't want to hear anymore. It just makes me too angry. And then I got this sudden thought. It was kind of a vision. And I'm thinking, wouldn't it be cool if suddenly when the bureaucrat has just said, we will put you out of business, this guy in a pinstripe suit with a briefcase shows up and says, we are taking over this man's case. We will litigate it not only as long as it takes, we will seek to prolong the litigation. We will publicize that litigation in ways that will embarrass you and your bosses. None of this will cost our client a penny, and we will reimburse him for any fine you are able to impose. And if you come back and bother him again, we will start the process all over again. And all at once, I also had the image of the government as the Wizard of Oz. I'm speaking to an audience that mostly has seen The Wizard of Oz. And you will remember that at the end, this great booming voice is revealed to be this pathetic old man when the curtain is pulled aside. And that's what I have in mind, to pull the curtain aside and demonstrate that all these thousands of laws that they have passed and regulations can only be enforced if we have voluntary compliance by the overwhelming majority of people. And that led to the idea that I advocate in the book for what I'm calling the Madison Fund, a large foundation that funds legal services that will champion individual citizens against Goliath. Its longer-range point is to make clear to other Americans that they don't have to take it anymore. There are ways to enforce an intrusive government to back off. Specifically, the Madison Fund would have three goals: to defend people who are innocent of the regulatory charges against them, but also to defend people who are technically guilty of violating regulations that should not exist, drawing out that litigation as long as possible, making enforcement of the regulations more expensive to the regulatory agency than they're worth, and reimbursing fines that are levied. Third, to generate as much publicity as possible, both to raise the public's awareness of the government's harassment of people like them and to bring pressure of public opinion to bear on elected politicians and the staffs of regulatory agencies. Or to put it in another way, suggested to me by the head of the Institute for Justice, I want to put sugar in the regulatory state's gas tank.